Welcome to Elysium Theatre Company's first podcast as part of our 50th anniversary tour of the island by Athol Fugard, Kani and Winston Ntshona. Recorded with Durham University, we'll be looking at the island's position in South African theatre, its role in resistance to apartheid, and its influence on world theatre in general. I'm Jake Murray, director of the production and artistic director of Elysium. With me is Paul Herzberg, a South African playwright and actor who now lives and works in the UK. Paul, tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience of growing up in apartheid South Africa and the work that you've done since.
I'll try and do this as quickly as I can, Jake. I was born in South Africa in the early 50s, right in the heart of the apartheid era. I had activist parents. I was schooled and went to university in South Africa. Then went to drama school at the same time I was at drama school in the early 70s. It was a very volatile time politically in South Africa, with lots of protests and political eruptions. But at the same time, what was very exciting as a young student was that the Space Theatre, which was started by Brian Astbury and Yvonne Bryceland, was just emerging. It was 1973, and it really was, other than the Little Theatre, which was the theatre that was attached to the university, the Space was really the only, if you like, commercial theatre that was hosting productions with mixed-race casts and with mixed-race audiences. Now, obviously, to the authorities at the time, this presented quite a significant potential problem, and the theatre was raided sometimes, and even during the productions, we were aware that there were security guys in the audience. It was a place where Fugard pioneered some of his early works, and one of those early works was the play that you've just directed, Jake, The Island, which I saw, I was 20 when I saw it. And it was 1973, and it was one of the very early productions of the Space with Kani and Winston Ntshona. And that play, as well as another play by Fugard called Dimitos, made a profound impression on me.
What was it about the plays that made that impression, particularly The Island?
I think it was Fugard's ability to take something as politically hot and contentious as human rights and apartheid, and transform it into a deeply human play set in one of the most controversial prisons on earth, as it was at the time. I mean, Mandela was obviously then still a prisoner. But Fugard, who was a massive influence on me as a writer, I think Fugard and Pinter, and possibly Miller and Mamet as well, but certainly Fugard, his work and his attitude towards his work, which was absolutely uncompromising and incredibly courageous, in the sense that he had the appetite and the talent and the drive to tackle incredibly contentious subjects in a very difficult political climate and humanize them and make them accessible to audiences. Those qualities moved me greatly and have been a great influence ever since. We're talking nearly 50 years hence. So actually, as an actor, my very first professional production was at the Space while I was still a student. I did 2 shows at the Space. And to be in that environment was dangerous. It was exciting. It was invigorating, and it in a sense, I wouldn't say it spoiled me, but it's certainly. Do tell me if I'm talking too much, Jake. You're welcome to interrupt. It certainly had a long and profound influence on my attitude to work. And it's only 2 or 3 times, I would say, since then that I've done work which has matched it in terms of the ability to excite the soul.
When you say that the experience of working at the Space was dangerous, what was dangerous about it?
In South Africa at the time, African and mixed race people were forced to live in their own group areas. So there were a whole lot of draconian measures in place under the apartheid regime, which made it very difficult for people who were not white to move from one place to another and to work. in an environment like the space. So the way the space got round it some of the time was to make it a club performance. In other words, notionally, only people who were invited could come. So there was quite a lot of stuff going on at the space where it was risky. It was especially risky for performers who were not white to come to the theatre and to participate in plays. But Asbury drove on nonetheless, as did Fugard.
And when you say you talked about Robben Island being one of the most notorious and controversial prisons in the world, as a white South African in his 20s, when you saw the island, how much did you know about Robben Island? Did it open your eyes to things, or how much were you aware of the experience of black people in South Africa under the apartheid regime?
Because my parents were trades unionists and because they were of the left and were certainly part of the anti-apartheid movement, I had grown up in a household which was quite highly politicized and had been made aware of a great deal of things. But I have to say that even as a sort of politicized young white man in South Africa at the time, there were things that I didn't know about, which the island brought home to me. I mean, I can still recall that first long scene of working with the wheelbarrows and the sweat, which was absolutely relentless in its theatricality. I mean, in a good way, and the sweat pouring off Kani, who was only probably a foot away from me, and I was in the front row, and how incredibly compelling it was. No dialogue.
For us working on the show, that was one of the biggest challenges, because we were very aware. A lot of the reviews that talked about previous productions talked about this legendary opening sequence where there's no dialogue, where you're given the stage directions, and somehow you have to work out how you're going to make this compelling. And we worked incredibly hard to make that work. We had some wonderful music, and by the time we got it right, it is an extraordinary way of starting a play. And I completely understand what you're saying. And it's what we've learned as we've worked on it is just what a groundbreaking play the play was for South Africa, which is why I was asking you what it was like to see it. And I understand it wasn't originally allowed to be called The Island. Is that correct?
It was originally called Die Hordosche Span. I can't recall now why the name changed, but that was its original title. Yeah,
I think it was to do with the fact that it was illegal at the time to mention Robben Island or the penal on stage. And interestingly, in the very last scene, when they performed their play within a play, they called themselves the Hordosche Span, which is quite special. When you said that the theatre that you saw and you were in at the space inspired the work that you've done since. Can you say a little bit more about that? How would you say that's inspired your work and the work that you've chosen to do?
Well, as an actor, I've had to be sometimes pragmatic, but I have tried to exercise some degree of choice. As a writer, I'm irrevocably drawn to plays that explore issues of race and issues around character under stress. I like to explore stories where ordinary people are placed in extraordinary circumstances and need to make very difficult moral and ethical choices in those circumstances. And it was the fact that I think life and art were inextricably linked in South Africa. To go into a South African theatre and see sort of rarefied British farces, to me just didn't. Not that I'd say that comedy and satire don't have a place, but the kind of work that I'm drawn to as a result of having cut my teeth as a professional actor as a space is plays that deal with the big issues of the times, And I think the genius of the island is that it still feels as contemporary now as it did in 1973.
We felt that the interesting thing about doing it 50 years on and almost 30 years on after apartheid fell, that the play now has a kind of universal aspect to it, although it's very rooted in its time and space. Because Fugard doesn't give you the details of what's going on outside the prison, it becomes a metaphor for prisons all over the world. Do you think that, would you say that it's interesting, I did a Fugard play a few years ago, Playland, and there was a South African woman in the audience on a talkback who said something very similar to what you said, was that in South Africa, everything you did was political. The cornflakes you ate in the morning were political. Every choice you made was political. But when she came to Britain, because eventually she couldn't continue living under the apartheid regime, she was surprised to find that it was perfectly possible to live your life in Britain and not be political at all. Is that an experience you've had here? And do you feel that's influenced the way you've written?
I think that assessment is in the context of South Africa is under apartheid certainly is pretty accurate. I think that I arrived here in the mid-70s after having served as a conscript in the Angolan border war, and that's the point at which I decided I couldn't be, an apartheid foot soldier for one more second. When I was demobbed, I left. That was 76. But I think even living here, I'm always drawn to subject matter that is contentious. And in fact, all of the work that I've written, except for one, has attempted to tackle those subjects that I'm talking about. The racial tension, irrational oppression of other people, character under stress. You've directed one of my plays at the Royal Exchange, The Dead Weight, which is a similar genre to Playland. But just going back to Robben Island for a second, in 2003, I was commissioned to write a play which was mostly set on Robben Island, and I visited it several times. And I think unless you've been physically there, it's difficult to appreciate just how deeply oppressive that prison is physically. If you're standing in Table Bay in Cape Town and you look across Robben Island, is this little glittering jewel in the Atlantic, and it looks very, very close to the main Cape Coast there. But I think there's only been one instance where somebody managed to escape. There were great whites in that bay, and I think the shortest distance there is something like 14 kilometers. So, if you're an Olympic swimmer and you're very lucky, and you've got something to keep you warm, you might make it across the bay, but it's impossible. As a place to escape from, it's absolutely impossible. The other thing that I came to understand is, in a sense, it was like a university for quite a lot of the prisoners. There was a premium put on education, and sometimes classical education and reading and passing knowledge on from one person to another. And I saw it as a place where intellectuals were imprisoned by idiots. Idiots, unfortunately, with a lot of power. But it is a very stark and bleak place to visit if you are there.
Because I think what you said about, as you say, a university, that almost the entire first cabinet of Mandela's presidency was made up of inmates, wasn't it? Sisulu and all those different people. That there was a very strong intellectual resistance there.
There was Ahmed Kathrada. It was, I think, also on the island. If I'm not mistaken, the period that I wrote about was the period of the Sasso Nine, and the Steve Biko era. And while Steve Biko wasn't on Robben Island, his compatriots like Strini Moodley, with whom I became friendly after writing about him, they were there. And I think the Black Consciousness movement intersected with the African National Congress intelligentsia on the island as well. So that was all going on.
Can you tell a little bit about Strini Moodley and your relationship with him?
Strini was one of Biko's lieutenants. He was an intellectual and an activist who was right at the core of the Black Consciousness movement. And Mandela talks about him in The Long Walk to Freedom. Mandela absorbed some of the, if I'm not mistaken, some of the ideas of the Black Consciousness guys. So there was this ideological cross-fertilization that went on to some extent. And Srini sadly passed away quite a few years ago, but he was a monumental figure in the Black consciousness movement.
Tell me a little bit about, so obviously you say that Fugard is one of the kind of most influential playwrights in your life that you've encountered. You've also performed in his plays. Am I right about that?
Yes, I got my equity grant doing Hello and Goodbye for the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield in 1978 as a very young actor. And then in, I think it was 79, I was cast as Shorty Langerfeld in People Are Living There with Maggie Tyzak playing Millie at the Royal Exchange in the main house, which was directed by Andy Jordan. But I did People Are Living There for the BBC World Service. Actually, that was Andy Jordan again.
What would you say is special about him? Because I agree with you. The more I've worked with him, and also particularly I think the most interesting thing is, for me, is as an English director, sometimes when you read Fugard's work, it doesn't feel linguistically exciting. But as soon as a performer starts to, you hear the voices, as soon as you hear the South African voices, whether they're white South African or they're black South African, the language leaps off the page and becomes as vivid as you say, a Mamet or a Pinter or a J.M. Singh or a Sean O'Casey. And I think that his ear for dialogue, his ear for words, and he can go from being very gritty and dark to very poetic and moving. I think he's a great language playwright. But what is it for you that you think is inspirational about him?
I think there are several things. You've hit upon one of them, that in the mouths of people who characters who are not necessarily erudite or particularly well educated, he can make very simple dialogue deeply poetic and extremely powerful. I think his greatest talent is that he's able to explore very political, very contentious subjects in a very human way, in the same way that Miller could do it. And he's captured the musicality of South African colloquialisms and language in a very particular way. As an actor, I think, again, Williams, Fugard, Pinter, these guys, and having grown up in South Africa, I find his dialogue incredibly accessible.
Yes.
And, wonderful in the mouth and wonderful to say. So I think it's those two aspects, Jake, is making a very, very difficult subject matter highly accessible through very believable characters, the poetry of the language. And he also surprises the playwright in the choices he makes. And in the journeys his characters go on, there will be revelatory things. I mean, even in Hello and Goodbye, there's a very simple scene of a brother and sister, united in grief, very different, more or less on loggerheads with each other, going through a suitcase of belongings of their crippled father. And it is just an extraordinary scene, watching these two characters who are poor, who are disenfranchised, finding a degree of emotional connection with a suitcase full of oddities. That's his talent, Fugard.
We did Hello and Goodbye between Playland and the island, and it's interesting what you say, because I remember when we did it, it was just after the Black Lives Matter movement, the death of George Floyd, and we were very concerned about the fact that the play was about white South Africans, and we were worried that would be rejected because the assumption is that every white South African was an oppressor. And what was fascinating about doing Hello and Goodbye was finding out how, and it's a truth that you find with all the different totalitarian regimes of the world, that the totalitarian regimes and apartheid, although it was nominally democratic, wasn't, oppresses its own people too. Does that make sense? And I think what was fascinating when I did The Island was realizing that because there's something like 10 years between the two plays. I think Fugard wrote Hello and Goodbye when the economic situation for poor white people was intense in South Africa, and there was a very interesting thing I discovered, that apparently the concern of the regime was that the poor whites were starting to mix with the black population, and they were concerned that this white working class and black movement would start. And that's when they really started to put together the apparatus of apartheid to keep them apart. And what was so interesting about doing the island was seeing how, with both plays, Fugard was writing about the excluded and the crushed and the abandoned. And in both plays, the regime is identified as essentially exploiting people, and that was quite fascinating. And I think for me, one of the things that Fugard appeals to me is his humanism. That fundamentally speaking, he looks into people and understands their humanity, and that's why I think they still resonate, if that makes any sense. And I think also with the playwrights that you mentioned, Miller, Williams, and in your own work, there's a very, very strong sense that theatre can change the world in some way. That, as you say, the big questions, the big challenges, the big divisions in our societies, by confronting them, you can change them. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, and I think you make a good point, Jake. I think even in, when you directed The Dead Weight at the Royal Exchange, two things were particularly pertinent and moving for me. A, the play touched a generation who were not yet born when apartheid, well, they might have been born, but they knew very little about apartheid. And that the issues in the play, the issues of racial tension and of awareness, was something that they connected with. But more so was that there was an evening, I don't know if you remember, you probably do, where there were some Falklands war veterans. There were some British war veterans that came to see the play, who I imagine weren't of a particularly politicized nature, but the play touched them as well. And it just shows that, if you have a story that has a particular setting, like ours was set in southern Angola, if you can find a way to capture people's imagination through the story and through the profound changes that people go through under stress, it doesn't matter where it's set. And the fact that a Falklands veteran of 55 could find something, profound in that production to connect with, vindicated the choice, I think, doing it. Difficult as it was to get on, Jake.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I think that's right, and I think that theatre has the ability to open windows, take you onto a journey into worlds that aren't your own. And we found with the island that although in one sense you could ask, what is the connection between two black activists in a prison cell in Robben Island in 1973 under apartheid and people living in the north? Because the experience is completely different. The reaction we're having from the audience is quite wonderful. There's something about the play which gets into the heart, and people find themselves in it. They're inspired by it, and they're very moved by it. And I think if theatre's ability to leap boundaries, leap these divides, I think is really essential. And I think that's something that Fugard still has to offer us.
Well, in fact, the experience that I had as a conscripted soldier, both in 1971 and then being reconscripted into the Angolan Border War in 1976, has actually given rise to 4 separate scripts. The first one was The Song of My Father, which starred Mike Maloney and Henry Goodman, which was about my national service. Then there was Sweet Like Sugar, again, which was an Angolan war play, which traveled to Canada and was done here in London. And The Dead Weight, which was done in London and Manchester. And now The Moth, which you directed, which began life as a short monologue. And, each time I think, well, I've done with that raw material now. I can move on to something else. It offers me something new. I mean, I think possibly this time, this will be the last piece. But I think what informs all those plays is that there are occasions where unlikely bonds can develop between people. And when given the right circumstances, under extreme pressure, people can achieve a kind of state of grace and a greatness spiritually. and I certainly for the latter three plays that was the case.
Wonderful. I completely agree. And it's been fantastic talking to you, Paul. Is there anything you'd like to say just about what you think theatre going into the future could do or should do? Because one of the interesting things we've found with reviving these Fugards since 2019 is the feeling that the world is sliding back into an illiberal state, and that extremist voices that want to divide us on lines of race and religion, ethnicity, nationality are climbing back into the ascendance. What do you think theatre can do or say to that?
I think that assessment is right, Jake. I think, one of the new battlegrounds of political ideology is the internet, where very dark messages can very be easily spread, where political dragooning can take place. And I think we are entering an era where we're becoming more tribalized, alas, and more polarized yet again. These things are historically cyclical. What is theatre's place within that? I think, the debate about whether theatre can actually change people in the extreme, in their consciousness, that's a debate that's going to go on and on. But I think theatre has a duty to deal with heavy, contentious, dark, day-to-day issues, not always through tragedy and drama. It can be dealt with through comedy and satire. But I think, especially now in 2023, the theatre that I cut my teeth on, the kind of theatre that Fugard did at the Space, I'm hoping that there's going to be a resurrection of that kind of a playwriting.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul Herzberg.
Thank you, Jake.
Pleasure. Thank you. Great. For more details of Elysium Theatre Company's 50th anniversary tour of the island, see the context box below. Thank you.